The night has grown deep. Outside the window, soft raindrops tap against the glass. The air carries a quiet scent of old memories, books long closed, roads long traveled, and whispers from another time. You're safe now. The day is behind you. Let your thoughts slow down and your body sink into stillness. Tonight, let me tell you a quiet story. A story from America's past, told slowly, gently. To help you rest, to help you sleep. In the distant shadows of the 17th century, a cold wind touched the Atlantic coast. The waves whispered like old voices, and the sky remained heavy with forgotten dreams. Across the ocean, ships rocked with hope and fear. They carried men, women, and children toward a land they had never seen. A place whispered about in taverns and prayers. A new world, a land called America. These were not loud people. They did not shout their dreams. They carried them quietly, tucked into the folds of their garments, pressed between pages of worn-out books, hidden beneath their breath as they crossed the sea. The ships creaked in rhythm with their hearts. Salt clung to their faces, while the wind told stories that only they could hear. The journey was not gentle. Days stretched into weeks, and nights blurred into each other. But at last they arrived. The shore was wild. Trees older than memory stood watch. Birds cried across gray skies, and the land waited. They stepped onto soil that held no roads, no cities, no familiar sounds, just earth, stone, and silence. Here, they would begin again, not with celebration, but with quiet work. Not with trumpets, but with tired hands. They built with wood. Shelters made from what they could find. Wind still crept through the cracks. The cold curled into their bones. The fire burned, and each flicker told them, you are here, you're alive. Days passed in slowness. There was no rush. It's only the rhythm of survival. Cutting trees, hauling water, planting seeds, waiting. Some days they sang softly, old songs from older lands. Their voices barely lifted above the wind. Sometimes they wept. 4 homes left behind. 4 names now, only memories. But always they endured, and slowly the silence began to shift. A pathway was made, then another. Fields opened under the sun. Children were born. Seasons changed. And the new land started to remember them. But at night the silence returned. Thick, deep, and wide. It wrapped around their cabins. It crept beneath the doors. And as they lay down to sleep, they could hear the quiet heartbeat of the earth. This was the beginning. Not of a country, but of a presence. A settling, a sigh. Da. And in that sigh, America began. The forest stood endless. Tall trunks stretched into the sky, branches like arms locked in old conversations. Leaves rustled with stories. Stories no one had written down. Stories that belonged to the land. Before the settlers arrived, this land was home. Home to many. Tribes who knew the rivers, knew the trees, knew the skies, every mood. Their footsteps left no scars. Their words rode the wind like birds. The Lenape, the Powhatan, the Wampanoag, they lived with the seasons. They danced under stars. They listened to the rain, not as a nuisance, but as a song. Their homes were shaped by patience, their tools by time, their wisdom by the earth. When the strangers came, there was curiosity, then confusion, then concern. Gifts were traded, words were mined, smiles were offered. But underneath, a silence grew. The settlers struggled. Their crops failed. Sickness spread. Cold bit through every effort. And they looked to the native people with desperate eyes. Help came. Not with grand promises, but with quiet instruction. This is how you plant. This is how you fish. This is when the ground sleeps and when it wakes. Lessons spoken not in classrooms, but by firesides, by rivers, in shadowed groves. But shadows can grow, and misunderstanding thickens like fog in the valleys, where one saw sharing, another saw taking, where one saw land, another saw ownership. And slowly, tension replaced trust. Yet through it all, the nights continued. Long, still nights. Settlers stared at dark ceilings, wondering if they had made the right choice. Natives listened to new sounds in the woods, foreign axes, foreign footsteps. Both sides uncertain, both sides afraid. Still the fire burned. It always burned, small and stubborn, a flicker of survival, a glow against the unknown. Children grew, fences appeared. The forest thinned, and the land began to change, not quickly, not loudly, but surely, as if exhaling after a long breath. The hills remembered footsteps. The rivers remembered names. The soil kept secrets. And history settled in layers, soft and slow, waiting to be uncovered by the dreamers, who would one day sleep beneath the same stars. This was not yet a nation, not yet a war, not yet a flag, just a growing murmur, a presence, a pulse beneath the roots. And in that quiet, the story of America continued. Time passed like fog drifting over fields. Each morning came with soft light, each evening with tired silence. The settlers stayed. Their roots, though shallow, began to grip. Villages rose quietly, logs stacked upon logs, thatched roofs woven by hand. Chimneys puffed gentle smoke into cold skies. Each home was a whisper against the wild. Each rode a thread through endless trees. Men worked with heavy tools. Women stirred pots and tended fires. Children ran through the underbrush, chasing rabbits, collecting stones, learning the language of the land. There was no rush, no machines, only patience, only repetition. One nail at a time, one brick, one prayer, a meal shared in silence, a song hummed beside a fire, a hope that tomorrow would be enough. Seasons moved slowly. Winters were long and unforgiving. Snow blanketed everything, a hush upon the world. Inside cabins, families huddled close. Frost painted the windows. The wind howled outside like an ancient ghost. Spring arrived with mud and melt. Creeks overflowed. Chutes pushed through thawed earth. Birds returned, their wings brushing the sky. Life stirred again. The settlers wrote letters, though many would never be sent. They lit candles in the dark. They read scriptures. They whispered stories of old countries, of kings, of cities, of streets paved with stone. Here there were no kings, only elders, no cathedrals, only wooden churches, simple and still. They built schools, too, one room, one teacher, children in wool coats with red cheeks, learning letters, learning numbers, learning the name of this strange place they called home. At the edge of the forest, a new structure appeared. A meeting hall. Their voices rose softly at first. Discussions, decisions, ideas about fairness, about rights, about freedom. The seeds were small, but they were there, planted in soil, made from struggle and survival. No one declared a nation. No one drew lines on a map, but something was beginning. A thought, a feeling, a quiet push forward. Still the nights came. Still the winds blew. Still they slept beside fading fires and dreamed, not of glory, but of peace, a quiet place to belong. The story of America did not gallop or roar. It crept, it sighed, and beneath the stars it waited. The sky stretched wide over the colonies. Blue in the day, velvet at night. Beneath it, life moved slowly, step by step, plow by plow, breath by breath. The fields grew, corn, wheat, tobacco. Hands dug into the soil, fingers stained with earth. Every harvest was a quiet triumph, every meal a silent thank you. Horses pulled carts through dusty paths, wheels turned with groans. The roads remained uneven, carved by feet and time. Blacksmiths hammered metal into shape. The rhythm echoed through towns. Clang, clang, each strike a heartbeat of a growing land. In taverns, candles flickered. Men spoke in hushed tones, of taxes, of kings, of distant decisions made across the ocean. There were whispers, not yet shouts, not yet protests. Just small doubts settling in like evening fog. The British crown loomed distant but heavy. Laws arrived in ink, but weighed like iron. Some obeyed, some questioned, some waited. The mail came by horseback, slow and uncertain. Letters carried hopes, fears, and news that changed lives in quiet ways. Mothers taught their children to read, to write, to remember. Fathers carved toys from wood, built fences, sewed patience into every step. Colonial towns began to shape identity. Not English, not quite yet American. Something in between, something new, still forming, Church bells rang on Sundays. Families walked together. Scripture was read. But so were poems, essays, dreams written on parchment by candlelight. Slavery existed in shadows. Ships arrived quietly, chains hidden in the mist. Labor, unpaid and unseen, built wealth on suffering. Even in silence, the injustice spoke. The forest watched, unmoved, unchanging. Its trees older than memory, its roots tangled in everything. Time ticked on. The colonies grew. 13, each with its own rhythm, its own tone. But the same question stirred beneath them all. Who are we becoming? There were no answers yet, only thoughts. Only pens scratching slowly. Only feet walking paths never walked before. And every night, as fires dimmed and stars returned, a soft breath rose from the land. The breath of something beginning, soft as sleep. The story of America continued, not with noise, but with quiet determination. Morning light touched the wooden shutters. Birdsong drifted over dew-covered grass. The colonies awoke slowly, gently as they always had. People rose early. Fires were kindled, bread was baked. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes. Another day like the last. But something was changing. Not in the sky, not in the soil, but in the minds of men. A quiet unease, slow awakening. Newspapers arrived. Pages rustling like dry leaves. Printed words traveled faster than wagons, faster than whispers. They spoke of taxes, of tea, of liberty. Men gathered in taverns, not just to drink, but to listen, to talk, to wonder aloud. What does freedom mean? What does loyalty cost? Where do we stand? There were still fields to plow, cows to milk, letters to write. But these tasks were no longer enough to quiet the questions. Across the sea, a king ruled. A parliament decided. But here in the dusty roads and village halls, new voices began to stir. Voices that did not yell. Not yet, they asked. They reasoned. They read. Pamphlets passed from hand to hand. Some ignored them. Some feared them. Some read them under candlelight. Again and again in Boston, there was tension. Footsteps quickened on cobblestones. Redcoats watched from corners. The air held a hum, like thunder too far to hear, but close enough to feel. Tea was dumped into the harbor. Silently in the cold night, no speeches. It's only a statement, soft but bold. In Philadelphia, men with pens met in quiet rooms. They debated with calm voices, argued with controlled words, wrote with steady hands. The idea of America was still fragile, still whispered, but it was there, growing in the stillness. At home, families kept living, planting, teaching, praying. But now, they looked at each other differently. The air carried more than wind. It carried hope, fear, possibility. No one knew what would happen, but everyone knew something was happening. And in that soft breath between peace and storm, the land waited. The story continued, still slow, still quiet, still unfolding. The morning began like any other. Mist hung low across the fields. The sun crept over the horizon. Birds sang softly in distant trees. Children yawned beside the hearth. Fires were lit. Bread was kneaded. Water was drawn. And yet something had changed. Quiet shift in the air. Whispers had grown louder. It's not in volume, but in weight. A word passed from lips to letters. Freedom, what had once seemed distant, was now at the door. The colony stirred. 13 small lights glowing in the dark, each one different, each one uncertain. But they began to flicker together. A slow-burning unity. Meetings were held in barns and taverns. Ideas were shared over cider and candlelight. Should men govern themselves? Could a people write their own path? Questions filled the silence. The king's hand reached tighter. New taxes, new rules, new soldiers in the streets. Redcoats, stiff and silent, marched past wooden homes. Boots on dirt roads, eyes from windows followed them. Then came a shot. Just one. No one knew who fired it, but it broke the silence. Lexington. Concord. The names echoed softly. Not a war yet. Something had begun. A line was crossed. Not in anger, but in resolve. Men left their plows behind. picked up muskets with shaking hands, not trained, not prepared, but ready for something greater than themselves. Women held homes together, tended to wounds, passed messages in secret, wrote letters full of quiet strength. Children watched, their eyes wide with wonder and fear. In between battles, there was stillness, fires in the dark. Songs hummed under breath, hope wrapped in silence, across the land. People waited for news, for letters, for signs of change. The wind carried stories of courage, of loss, of impossible odds, then a document. Written with care, with belief, with fire. The declaration, a letter to the world, a promise to the future. All men are created equal, yet words so simple, yet heavy with meaning, read aloud in village greens, hung in town halls, carried in memory. The war was not over, but something had shifted, a step forward, quiet but firm, toward a nation not yet born, but already breathing. And through the night, under stars and silence, America dreamed. The war did not end quickly. It lingered, like fog in the morning fields. Year after year, step after step, the people endured. Battles erupted, then faded. Smoke curled over valleys. Gunfire cracked the air, then silence returned. Always the silence returned. Soldiers marched, boots worn thin, clothes torn, bellies empty, but they marched. For something they couldn't yet touch, only believe in. The winters were cruel, snow-covered tents. Frost clung to eyelashes. Valley Forge was cold beyond words. Fires flickered low, supplies ran out. Still they stayed. Washington watched quietly. He spoke little, but his presence held them together. He led with calm, with steadiness, with silence that gave strength. Families waited at home. They cooked, they prayed, they hoped. Each knock at the door, a flutter of fear. Each letter a breath of life. Not all battles were fought with muskets. Some were fought with patience, with long days in empty fields, with hunger, with doubt. Still, the cause remained. A free land, a voice of their own. An end to distant rule. Farms became camps. Churches became shelters. Villages became lines on a map. War spread across everything. And yet, life continued. Children were born, bread was baked, songs were still sung, even if softer. They learned to fight differently, to move through trees, to strike and vanish, to use the land as both shield and weapon. They knew the rivers, the hills, the weather. They used it all, because this land was home. They defended it like breath itself. Then came allies, ships from France. Officers with new plans. Hope arrived. Floating on the sea breeze, the war shifted. Momentum changed. Victories came, small but real. Finally, Yorktown, the last great clash, the last roar, and then a surrender. No cheers, only quiet, only tired eyes, and a sky that looked the same as it always had. But underneath that sky, something had changed. The colonies were no longer just survivors. They were something new. They had earned rest. And as they slept, the silence returned. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of peace. The war had ended. The noise faded. The smoke cleared. And a deep, uncertain silence remained. No parades filled the streets. No grand celebrations. Just small gatherings. Quiet prayers of thanks. The people were free, but freedom was unfamiliar. It had no map, no instruction, only hope. 13 colonies stood alone together, separate but bound by memory, by sacrifice, by something not yet formed. There was no king, no crown, only questions. Who would lead? How would they live? What would they become? Men met in halls and taverns. They debated, they disagreed. They returned the next day, and the next. They tried again. The Articles of Confederation came first, a loose bond, a thread too thin. It held for a moment but unraveled in the wind. States acted like nations, each with its own coin, its own rules, its own pride. Trade stumbled, borders blurred, voices clashed. Some feared chaos, others feared control. But they remembered the war. They remembered the price, and they knew they had to shape something stronger. So they gathered again, Philadelphia. In the summer heat, windows shut tight. Papers spread across wooden tables. Ideas flowed slowly, one word at a time, one breath at a time. A constitution began to form with ink and argument, patience and compromise. Not perfect, but enduring. Not loud, but powerful. It spoke of balance, of liberty. 3 branches, each held in check, each bound by law. The people would govern. Through vote, through voice, through time. Still, there was doubt. Fear of another king, even one in different clothes. But the paper was signed, the words were sent, and the people chose to try. A president was selected, George Washington, not by force, but by trust. He stood not on a throne, but on ground stained by effort. He bowed to no crown, only to the people. The capital was small, the government smaller, but it had begun, the experiment, the republic, and across quiet farms, quiet towns, the people listened, they watched, and they wondered what would come next. The war had ended, the smoke had cleared, but the silence remained, a new silence, a silence filled with questions. What now? Who would lead? How would a nation be built from nothing? The capital, for now, was Philadelphia. Streets buzzed with quiet purpose. People spoke in careful tones. There was hope. There was fear. But above all, there was work. George Washington took office, not as king, not as ruler, but as president, a leader chosen, not crowned. He walked softly. He spoke simply. He set the tone. Cabinet formed around him, men with strong ideas, different visions, different voices, but a shared goal, to shape the republic. Alexander Hamilton spoke of finance, of banks, of building credit. Thomas Jefferson spoke of the land, of farmers, of freedom in the fields. They debated, they disagreed, but they remained, together, working. A constitution had been written, but could it hold? 13 states truly become one. Laws were passed, courts were formed, the first dollar was minted, the post office took shape. Step by step, the structure stood. Still, challenges appeared. Debt from the war lingered. A whiskey tax stirred protest. Farmers in western hills rose in anger. Washington responded, with calm, with force, but no revenge. Law had been tested, and it stood. Out beyond the settled towns, the land stretched west. Endless, open, calling, settlers packed wagons. They crossed rivers, climbed hills, built homes in forests. They carried with them the idea of America, but that land was not empty. Native nations lived there, lands long held, now threatened. Tensions rose. Treaties were signed. Many were broken. The frontier grew louder. Still the stars expanded. New states joined the flag. 15, then more. A union growing slowly. Washington made a choice. He stepped down. Hour passed. Without blood, without war. The world watched. And the people exhaled. A peaceful transfer. A quiet first chapter. The nation had begun, not perfectly. It had begun. The new nation stood quietly. Not yet powerful, not yet complete. But breathing, living, becoming. A new president took office. John Adams. A voice of reason, of law, of thoughtful pause. The people watched carefully. Could the republic survive change? Across the Atlantic, France erupted. Revolution there was louder, bloodier. Americans watched and wondered, was this their future too? At home, politics deepened. Parties began to form. Federalist, Republican, 2 paths, 1 country. Debates filled newspapers, coffee houses, taverns. Still, life moved on. Fields were plowed. Children learned letters. Church bells rang each Sunday. And in the silence between arguments, America grew. In 1800, a peaceful election. Jefferson won. Adams stepped down. Power passed again without war, without swords. This was rare. This was history. And it was quiet. Jefferson dreamed westward. Of land, freedom, of space to breathe. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. $15 million, land beyond imagination, mountains, rivers, endless skies. 2 men were chosen, Lewis and Clark. They left with maps, with notes, with hope. They walked where no one from their world had walked. They met tribes, saw animals unknown, touched rivers that carved the land. For centuries, the frontier whispered. It called to settlers, to wanderers, to dreamers. But expansion brought tension. New land meant new choices. Would slavery expand too? Could balance be kept? In small homes, families lit candles, spoke of new states, read news aloud, listened to silence afterward. The flag gained stars. Each one earned, each one debated. The young nation was restless. It wanted more. More land, more voice, more future, and yet it was still learning, still stumbling, still standing. As night returned, as wind crossed open plains, a quiet truth settled in. This was not the end, only the middle of a very long story. America in the mid-20th century was an anxious place. Was this country on the brink of economic collapse? Was it about to be nuked by the Soviets? Would this or that city be underwater by the year 2000? What was the role of the federal government? Just search for us in your favorite podcast app or click the link in the description below. Look, here's what we're going to do. If you leave us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, we will pretty much always respond to your review. So if you have something nice to say, we're probably going to say something nice back. First, a deep dive into one major story from each president's term. Now, I know that might sound like the opposite of what you're hoping for when you press play on a fun history podcast, but hear me out. In each episode, we'll highlight 1 or 2 individuals who helped shape the course of history. Some will be famous, some will be infamous, and some you may never have heard of. But all of them will have something to teach us. When you zoom out, you can see that these decades fell into distinct periods defined by certain personalities, events, and issues. Sounds great, Ben, but why listen to you? Why listen to anybody? Everybody's got an agenda. Well, if you want to know my agenda, here it is. My goal is to give you all the information you need to form your own opinions about this pivotal period in American history. I bring no political baggage to this series, not trying to sell you on any particular point of view, exploring how large historical currents played themselves out in the lives of everyday Americans. I know that even the way I frame a question can sometimes nudge you toward a certain answer. But I'll tell you what I won't do. I won't talk down to you. So you'll get 2 brand new episodes every week. Again, our first episode, The Sun Also Rises Again, is available right now wherever you listen to podcasts. So give it a listen and get ready to learn something new every week. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time on The Quiet Expansion, a new series from the American History Tellers. I won't insult your intelligence, and I won't try to cram 50 years of history into a single sentence. And we'll see how ordinary people both shaped and were shaped by the events around them. Then leave us a 5-star rating and a nice little review, and send us an email at the address provided below. Let us know and we'll send you a book. It's that simple. Nixon and Watergate, Carter and stagflation, Reagan and the end of the Cold War, George H.W. Bush and the end of the 20th century. Each of these moments encapsulates a unique set of challenges and opportunities that will reveal so much about the country we live in today. And if you have something constructive to say, these movements and trends may seem familiar, but believe me, they weren't always popular. Sometimes they were downright terrifying. And exploring them will allow us to see how the United States changed and sometimes resisted changing. Well, we're almost certainly going to take it to heart. We've earned that with our years of toil and sweat, not blood, but mostly toil and sweat. The Quiet Expansion will explore every aspect of American life in this period. We'll talk about culture and sports and business and labor and technology and urban development. Yeah, and we'll talk about all kinds of domestic policy, too, from education to healthcare to the environment. Hey, what should it be? Send us an email at the address provided below and let us know, and we'll send you a digital copy of my book, Founding Rivals. But here's the thing. For a lot of Americans, the latter half of the 20th century feels like a distant, almost mythological time, right? We remember the broad strokes, sure. There was a Cold War, and there was the Vietnam War, and then there was Watergate, and then Ronald Reagan, and then Nirvana. And then we all became obsessed with True Detective Season 1, and everything was awesome. Until it was UNT. And then we started fighting each other on Twitter. And now we re-fighting each other on Threads. A New York Times and Washington Post bestseller that tells the story of how the founding fathers created a government that has lasted 500 years. You quickly realize that this narrative does uneven begin to capture the breadth and depth of the changes that occurred in the United States from 1945 to 2000. Oh, did you think they invented the internet in the 1990s? Nope. Oh, did you think gay people just suddenly appeared in the 2000s? Nope. Did you think the idea of global warming was invented by Al Gore? Well, sort of, but not exactly. All of these stories and many more are part of the quiet expansion, and understanding them will help us understand ourselves today better. Trust me, you can read it on your Kindle or other ebook reader, or we can send you a paperback. How do we square our growing inequality with our democratic ideals? And what are we going to do about all these dang hippies? Well, if you've got some free time on your hands over the next several decades, and boy have I got the history podcast for you. I am so very pleased to announce the release of The Quiet Expansion, a new series that takes a deep dive into the slow history of America between the end of World War II and the beginning of the 21st century. We'll be looking at how the United States grew dramatically in size and population, while also confronting the persistent anxieties of the atomic age. We all talk about presidents, and presidents, and presidents, and one briefly about Harry Truman because he was really cool. We all see how Washington grappled with the changing roles of government in an era of dramatic social change. Look, I know what you're thinking. Oh, the 1960s were groovy, and the 70s were disco. And then there were those totally bitchin' 80s, and then things kind of sucked until Facebook happened. The Sun Also Rises Again, which is now available wherever you normally listen to podcasts. In it, I explore how the post-war boom changed the American landscape and made possible the incredible growth of suburbia. It was also the moment when the United States began acquiring land at an astonishing rate. And no, we didn't build any of it. But trust me, if you think you know the 20th century, just wait. This is going to be a wild ride. So get your bell-bottoms and shoulder pads pressed. Order yourself a gallon of Aquanet. Don your finest acid-wash denim and prepare to party like it's 1984. Except you won't be able to do any of those things. Because I haven't invented any of those things yet. Just go ahead and order a glass of Tang instead. We're starting this series with episode 1, so if you'd like to listen to The Quiet Expansion. And once you've left us a review, okay, I'm done pimping my book. But if you spend any length of time in the archives, so here's what you can expect from this series. Second, we'll explore the underlying themes that define this period, from civil rights to the counterculture, to the sexual revolution, to the opioid epidemic. Third, we'll continue to tell the stories of the people who made this country what it is today. As always, we'll be weaving together the big picture with the little picture. And finally, unlike our flagship show, The American Story, which focuses primarily on politics. Now I know what you're thinking. Look, I'm not naive. So if you're ready to join me on this incredible journey, then head on over to your favorite podcast app. Search for The Quiet Expansion. Subscribe. Oh, and one final thing. We're going to be releasing episodes of The Quiet Expansion every Wednesday and Friday. For most of human history, sleep has been associated with death. In fact, it's generally understood that we only sleep because we are biologically programmed to conserve energy in order to survive. But is that true? Do we really only sleep to save energy? And how has America's relationship with sleep changed over time? Welcome to my channel. And houses were separated into private spaces with locked doors that the bedroom as we know it began to emerge. At a stroke, electric light made it possible to see in the dark and therefore to do things in the dark. Most importantly, it allowed people to read and write in the dark, which meant that people could enjoy books and newspapers at night without straining their eyes during twilight hours. You see, the same features that made electricity so useful also made it a threat to sleep. One of the reasons that early humans avoided lying on their backs while sleeping is that it made it harder to escape danger. You see, the average American doesn't get enough sleep. Well, one idea is to push back bedtime. But today, artificial lighting and climate control mean that we must take a more active role in regulating our own sleep cycles. The good news is that our bodies are incredibly adaptable. Should we stay in bed and keep trying to fall asleep? Or should we get up and do something else? The answer is it depends. Please remember that we wouldn't be able to explore these fascinating topics without your support. So thank you for watching and for learning with us. See you next time. If you've been in bed for more than 20 minutes and can't fall asleep, you should get up and do something relaxing. Like reading a book or listening to music. Just avoid screen time, which can make it harder to fall asleep. Once you start to feel tired, you should return to bed. If we follow certain guidelines, we should be able to live healthy lives with ample amounts of rest. That means going to bed and waking up at the same time every day, even on weekends, exposing ourselves to bright light in the morning, and exercising regularly. If we do these things, we'll be able to reap the many benefits of a good night's sleep. Researchers have discovered that our need for sleep is influenced by two biological rhythms. The first is the ultradian rhythm, which regulates sleep every 90 minutes. The second is the circadian rhythm, which regulates sleep over a 24-hour period. Because of these rhythms, there are times of day when we are naturally more alert and times when we are naturally more drowsy. By understanding these patterns, we can try to schedule our activities accordingly. For example, many people are naturally drowsy between 2 and 4 p.m., so it might be a good idea to take a nap or schedule meetings for another time. Or we could simply accept that we won't be as productive at certain times of day and plan accordingly, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Only 30% of adults get the recommended 7 or more hours of sleep per night, and even that amount of sleep may not be enough. In fact, scientists are still discovering all the ways that sleep affects our daily lives. For example, sleep helps improve motor skills. In one study, researchers found that subjects who got more sleep were better able to perform tasks that required hand-eye coordination. Another study found that sleep deprivation increases the risk of heart attacks. Yet another study found that people who slept more were less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. There are probably countless other examples of this, and each discovery reminds us that we cannot afford to lose sleep. Researchers peg the consequences of insufficient sleep at $27 billion annually in lost productivity and medical costs. This is largely due to the fact that shift work and electric lighting have untethered our circadian rhythms from the natural day-night cycle. In other words, we no longer have to go to bed when we retired or wake up when the sun rises. Instead, we can choose to work night shifts, which means that fewer biological processes regulate our sleep cycles. Well, in the days of electric lighting, there was no need to worry about being attacked at night. And since our bodies aren't capable of distinguishing between physical danger and psychological danger, we were free to indulge in the luxury of lying on our backs. When we sleep on our backs, our brains get more oxygen, so we feel more refreshed in the morning. Plus, it's simply more comfortable. In fact, researchers pegged the explosion in back-to-sleep infant deaths on the fact that parents were finally able to ignore their instincts and allow their kids to sleep more comfortably on their backs. In 1882, a writer for Scientific American reported that electricity had conquered the night. But with the invention of air conditioning, we can control the temperature and humidity levels in our bedrooms to ensure that we wake up feeling hydrated. We can also use blackout curtains to block out any ambient light, making it easier to fall asleep. Finally, with all of our worries about safety and comfort addressed, we are able to sleep more soundly. In other words, thanks to modern conveniences, we can finally sleep on our backs with our mouths open, something that our ancestors couldn't do for hundreds of thousands of years. The introduction of electric lights in factories allowed workers to keep working after the sun set. Eventually, streetcars illuminated public spaces, allowing people to stroll or shop at night. Electricity not only made it possible to work in the dark, it also made it possible to play. As the poet Carl Sandburg wrote, "Before electric lights, the town was full of darkness. When the arc lights and incandescent bulbs came, the town was full of fun." Up until this point, bedrooms weren't necessarily places where people slept, and movie theaters often didn't let out until midnight. Before electricity, timekeeping devices were primarily regulated by the position of the sun. But now that people could illuminate their homes at will, they no longer needed to adhere to the same schedule as the sun. Instead, they could go to bed whenever they pleased and wake up refreshed for a full workday. In fact, the advent of electric light led to shorter working hours and a higher standard of living. So it seems that electricity was instrumental in creating modern life as we know it. To accommodate these evening activities, The concept of the evening or dinner jacket became popular. It was a stylish yet comfortable option for men who didn't want to change out of their suits after a day at work. Men wore them to restaurants, theaters, and parties, and some men continued to wear them while driving their cars, a symbol of wealth and leisure time. They may have doubled as living rooms or dining rooms. And the distinction between day and nighttime was blurred. People worked by the light of the sun, but they would use candles or oil lamps to extend daylight hours so they could work longer. At night, these lamps would also illuminate bedrooms, so that people could continue working even after dark. However, as outdoor lighting improved, indoor lighting took on a different purpose. It's time for bed. Before the invention of electric lighting, nightfall meant darkness. And when humans first started to sleep at night, they did so with one eye open. This isn't surprising when you consider that sleep was associated with death. Because people slept at night, they would choose sleeping arrangements that made it easy to flee if an animal or an attacker approached. For example, they would avoid lying on their backs, which made it harder to escape, and they would frequently move to a new sleeping spot rather than staying in one place for too long. Even more tellingly, until very recently, parents didn't let their babies fall asleep on their stomachs. The fear of suffocating was just too great. These fears also led early humans to build structures like houses, walls, and even fences around their beds. They wanted to be able to sleep safely, but a safe place doesn't equal a pleasant place. Sleeping arrangements were based on fear rather than comfort. It was until indoor plumbing became widespread in the 19th century. When Thomas Edison invented the incandescent light bulb in 1879, it transformed society's relationship with the darkness. By the turn of the 20th century, it was common for department stores to stay open until 10 p.m. or later. The development of the electric light also changed how people thought about time. But was this a blessing or a curse? Another reason early humans wouldn't have slept with their mouths open is that it would dry out their saliva and cause them to wake up with a sore throat. Not everyone, however, has enjoyed the benefits of these sleep-conducive inventions. So what can we do about it? In the past, our body's need for sleep was regulated by external factors like sunlight and temperature changes. You see, sleep helps us restore and rejuvenate our immune systems, process memories, and make better decisions. It also reduces stress and improves our overall health. So what should we do on those nights when we just can't sleep? As we end tonight's episode, what if I told you that in 1920? A group of elite global bankers met at an international congress in Brussels and discussed ways to make money from racial conflict. And what if I told you that this plan is playing out right before our very eyes today? You probably think that such a plan does not exist, or that it's just another wild conspiracy theory. Why, you might ask? Because they saw the growing threat of fascism in Europe, and they wanted to prevent it from taking root in America. Well, it's because they believed that the existing social and economic order was unsustainable. The bankers thought they could maintain control over the country and prevent any one group from becoming too powerful. Each state would be economically dependent on the others. How could these bankers even come up with such a crazy plan and then actually believe that they could implement it? Well, the answer lies in their ideology. These bankers were part of a small group of elites who believed that they were superior to the masses. The book was published in 1924, and it laid out the case for dividing the United States along racial lines. In reality, there was no real conflict between the races. But the bankers were willing to fund anything that would help them achieve their goal. The bankers funded a series of lawsuits that were designed to test the boundaries of racial segregation. They argued that the Supreme Court's previous rulings in favor of segregation were unconstitutional. The case was a direct challenge to the racial segregation laws in Missouri, and the Supreme Court ruled that they were unconstitutional. They created schools and churches that taught white Americans that they were superior to other races. The country did on break up into 5 separate states, and the white race did on take over everything. Instead, the country descended into chaos and violence, and they used their financial power to manipulate politicians into supporting their cause. The country was divided along racial lines, and the legacy of that division continues to this day. This was a major victory for the bankers, and it opened the door for the division of the country along racial lines. The bankers are hoping that by promoting racial division, first we need to understand that the bankers are not our friends. They are not looking out for our interests. and they will exploit any division that they can find to increase their power. Second, we need to remember that we are all Americans first and foremost. We should not let the bankers divide us along racial or religious lines. Finally, we need to be vigilant and call out the bankers whenever they try to promote division and hatred. They will be able to weaken the country and make it easier to control. The bankers' plan may have failed in the mid-20th century, but they are trying again today. Once again, they are funding organizations that promote racial division, and they are using their financial power to manipulate politicians into supporting their cause. So my friends, the battle for the soul of America is far from over. The bankers are still trying to divide us along racial lines, and it's up to us to stop them. Let us remember that we are all Americans first and foremost, and let us stand together against the forces of racism and hatred. Thank you. And they pushed for a new ruling that would allow for the division of the country along racial lines. The new nationalism became a bestseller, and Flynn became a household name. The plan was set in motion. Flynn argued that the country had become too diverse, and that the different races were in conflict with each other. He claimed that the only way to solve this problem was to divide the country into separate states where each race could live on its own. They saw themselves as the intellectual and financial leaders of society, and they believed that it was their duty to guide the country in a way that would benefit the most people, and the bankers would be able to manipulate them as they saw fit. The case dealt with the constitutionality of a law that required racial segregation in public facilities. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of segregation, but it was a close decision. The bankers saw this as a sign that they could push further, and they continued to fund lawsuits that challenged the existing social order. The growing middle class was becoming too powerful, and the country was becoming too democratic. How could they get the public to go along with such a radical plan? Well, the answer lay in propaganda. The bankers funded a massive campaign to promote the idea of dividing the country along racial lines. They created pamphlets, books, and articles that argued that it was in the best interest of everyone involved. They funded fake news websites and newspapers that spread their message to the masses. And they even created Hollywood movies that portrayed the different races as being superior. They wanted to create a new order that would be more favorable to their interests. But they were so convinced of their own superiority that they truly believed that they were doing what was best for the country. They saw the growing threat of fascism in Europe, and they wanted to prevent it from taking root in America. They believed that by creating 5 separate states, each with its own identity and government, they could maintain control over the country and prevent any one group from becoming too powerful. But their solution was nothing short of radical. They proposed creating 5 separate states out of the current United States. But what if I told you that it's all recorded in writing, documented, and archived for all of us to see? Well, let me tell you about it, because today we're going to uncover the truth about the divided paths. These men weren't members of the KKK or some white supremacist group. They were the world's leading bankers, including J.P. Morgan Chase and Company, Goldman Sachs, and the Bank of England. What if I also told you that these bankers created a secret plan for destroying the United States and dividing it into 5 separate countries? The bankers saw an opportunity to exploit these divisions and create a more manageable country that would be easier to control. The idea was to have a white Anglo-Saxon state in the Northeast and Midwest, a black state in the South, a Hispanic state in the Southwest, an Asian state in the Pacific Northwest, and a Native American state in the Great Plains. It all started on August 12, 1920, when the most powerful bankers and financiers from around the world gathered together for the International Bankers' Congress in Brussels. The event was hosted by the Brussels Economic League, a secretive organization founded in 1910 by Max Vorburg and Paul M. Vorburg, who also played a key role in the creation of the Federal Reserve. The purpose of this league was to bring together the most powerful people in finance from around the world to discuss the future of the global economy. But the 1920 conference was no ordinary event. It was here that the elite bankers hatched a plan to divide the United States along racial lines. At the time, the U.S. was a melting pot of cultures and races, but it was also a country divided by deep social and economic inequality. Now, you might be wondering why the bankers didn't simply leave the country as is, but instead divided up along racial lines, by creating 5 separate states, each with its own identity and government. Now you might be asking, of course, in reality. They were only looking out for themselves and their own interests, but there was a problem. One of the most effective pieces of propaganda was a book called The New Nationalism. written by a man named John T. Flynn. Of course, Flynn was just saying what the bankers wanted to hear. But how could these bankers actually implement their plan? Well, the answer lay in the courts. One of the most important cases was Ginn v. United States, which was decided in 1923. The plan was finally put into action in 1927 when the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Missouri ex rel. Gaines v. Canada. Over the next few years, the bankers funded organizations that promoted the separation of the races. But as we all know, the plan didn't work out exactly as the bankers had hoped. And it wasn't until 1964 that the Civil Rights Act was passed outlawing racial segregation. But the damage had already been done. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this story is that it's not over yet. We can see this in the rise of white nationalism and the resurgence of the KKK. So what can we do to stop them? They are not a benevolent force, and we should not let them control our country. When we think of sleep gadgets, we think of fancy alarm clocks that make us wake up gently, or soothing lights that turn off when our eyes are droopy. But in the 1960s, some engineers thought that vibrating motors could be that next big thing for helping people sleep better. Created by a dentist named Dr. Aaron Shifitz. This particular contraption looked like two stacked hockey pucks with some springs and nuts and bolts attached to them. You place the device between your knees while lying on your back, and then hook the attached straps around the legs of your bed to keep it in place. We think of things like calming music or nature documentaries about baby pandas, but in the 1960s, they were still figuring out what worked best. So the GE engineers also considered pairing the pillow with white noise, which is supposedly good for blocking out distractions and getting you in the mood for bed. Then when it was time to sleep, you plugged in the device and turned it on. They recruited 5 volunteers to try it out in their sleep lab. In the 1960s, this was not a foregone conclusion. So the vibrating pillow was shelved indefinitely. We learned that there were multiple stages of sleep and that they each needed to be prioritized to ensure that you felt well rested when you woke up. This led to the creation of new technologies that monitored your sleep stages and gently woke you up when you were in the right stage. Back then, scientists knew relatively little about what made a good night's sleep, and they certainly didn't know why certain people have trouble sleeping. You see, most people don't just go from wide awake to fast asleep. You won't feel refreshed because you didn't spend enough time in the later stages. They do have some unique advantages. To make it more appealing, well, they went back to basics. They ditched the bulky mechanical motors for smaller electric ones and covered them with soft material, so they felt more like a pillow and less like a torture device. Some versions even incorporated heat and pressure sensors to make the pillow more comfortable and adaptable to different sleeping positions. And since the annoying factor is one of the main reasons that people simply ignore their alarms, and there's even a version that uses vibrations to improve your posture while you sleep, but despite all the bells and whistles that modern technology has brought to the vibrating pillow, the science behind its effectiveness has started to unravel. So further studies will be needed to draw any real conclusions. But on the whole, vibrating pillows seem to be a net positive when it comes to sleep quality. The researchers concluded that the pillow itself didn't have an effect on how long it took them to fall asleep. But the vibrating pillow did increase the amount of time participants spent in their lightest stage of sleep, which is exactly what they were hoping for. They're hoping that the vibrating pillow will make sure that doesn't happen. Nobody had actually been able to quantify that or explain why. But a follow-up study in 2017 suggested that the pillow might not work as well for people suffering from insomnia. Not only did the insomnia group spend less time in light sleep, they also didn't report feeling any more rested. A study published in 2014 tried to change that by recruiting 32 healthy adults to spend nights in a sleep lab. But while waking up earlier sounds bad, it's actually a good thing. See, if you're trying to wake up at a specific time, it's better to wake up earlier than you wanted to rather than later. Otherwise, that means you didn't spend enough time in your lighter stages of sleep. Half of the participants used a vibrating pillow, and the other half used a placebo pillow that didn't vibrate. For example, they can wake you up without disturbing anyone else in the room, which is important if you want to avoid being the bad guy who wakes everybody else up. It also means that you do and need to put your alarm clock within arm's reach to turn it off. So you can place the alarm source somewhere that's easy to misplace or ignore. So the ideal alarm clock would wake you up during your light sleep phase. That way you'd feel alert and ready to start the day without feeling groggy. So suddenly, the vibrating pillow was more relevant than ever. Instead, they pass through a transitional state where they're almost asleep, but could be woken up fairly easily. Once they're in this state, it takes about 20 minutes to fall into a light sleep and another 30 minutes before reaching a state of deep sleep. Unbeknownst to the researchers, she was a restless sleeper who talked frequently during her sleep. When she mentioned this to the research team, they played back the audio and compared it to an oscilloscope reading of the pillow's vibration patterns. After closely listening and observing, he concluded that the vibrations themselves didn't have any effect on speech whatsoever. If you snore or talk in your sleep, you snore or talk in your sleep. They realized that they hadn't accounted for talking sleepers in their design. All 5 subjects reported that they fell asleep faster and experienced fewer interruptions to their sleep. It was looking like the future was bright for the vibrating pillow. But that all changed when they recruited a 6th volunteer. Overall, 78% of users said that they slept better thanks to the pillow, and 63% said they'd be willing to buy one for themselves. Those are pretty solid numbers, but they weren't enough to sell the executives on the idea. Once you drifted off to sleep, the machine would start vibrating. And it turns out they were right. In theory, he believed that placing something hard between your knees might stop you from tossing and turning so much. And since tossing and turning is one of the most common reasons that people can't sleep, this seemed like a great idea. But in practice, the results were less than stellar. According to those who tried the device, it was more likely to just give you a really bad case of the hiccups. So it never caught on, and Dr. Chaffetz soon moved on to other inventions, but not in the way that they thought. Today, there's nothing unusual about a vibrating bedtime pillow. They resold everywhere from Amazon to Sharper Image, and even in places you would unexpect, like Cracker Barrel. But these modern versions bear little resemblance to the first vibrating pillows that hit the market in the early 1960s. The original model didn't look or feel anything like a pillow at all. In fact, the very first vibrating pillow wasn't designed to rest your head on. It was supposed to rest between your knees. Now, Dr. Chaffetz had his reasons for putting the vibration device between the knees. But many of the engineers working at General Electric saw potential in the vibrating knee pad. They thought that maybe if they changed its shape to fit more comfortably under a person's head, it could help combat insomnia. Their idea was that the gentle vibration would send relaxing signals to your brain and help you fall asleep faster. Now, when we think of sending relaxing signals to the brain to make sure their invention was safe, she found the pillow to be uncomfortably hard and couldn't get comfortable enough to fall asleep. God, but it wasn't the pillow itself that was at fault. So they took several of the volunteers' recordings home to listen to more closely. Despite this new knowledge, the project continued for another year, with hundreds of people testing the device, and there's one massive reason behind their reluctance. It might seem obvious now that a vibrating pillow isn't going to be comfortable for everyone. Ultimately, the executives decided that it was too risky to invest money in a product that might only appeal to a small subset of the population. Fast forward to the 1980s, and suddenly the question of what makes a good night. Sleep was a lot less mysterious. It turns out that the vibrating pillow was perfect for this application, if you're woken up during your deep sleep. While vibrating motors aren't the only way to accomplish this, the other key advantage of a vibrating alarm clock is that they read way less annoying than a loud buzzer. There's also evidence to suggest that vibrating motors might help people with dementia wake up more easily, making them ideal for use in care homes. But how did they update the design? As a result, today's vibrating pillows are gentler and more comfortable than ever. You see, while there was a lot of anecdotal evidence that people slept better with vibrating pillows, after tracking their sleep cycles, they also found that participants who used the vibrating pillow woke up earlier than the control group. So overall, the vibrating pillow was a success. However, the sample size was small and didn't account for other factors such as medication. And they go to show that sometimes the best ideas are the ones that just need a second chance. War is the favorite pastime of many Americans. They say that to truly understand another country, you need to look at how they wage war. And America does not do things in moderation. We'll take a look at America's history of waging war and conflict around the world. The ancestors of modern Americans came from England and other parts of Europe. This meant that it had the ability to project its power anywhere it wanted. As such, It intervened in numerous conflicts around the world. It has the largest military budget of any country and is involved in numerous conflicts around the world. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This is especially true when it comes to America's history of war. If Americans are to learn from the mistakes of the past, they must first understand them. Why should Americans remember their country's history? It seems that they're never satisfied with what they have and are always looking for more. This could be seen in the way that they intervene in other countries, the way that they conduct their foreign policy, or even the way that they fight their wars. What do you think? Do Americans do anything in moderation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode of The World is One Big Family Show. Thanks for watching. See you next time. For example, America has a history of intervening in the affairs of other countries, often in a unilateral manner. This has led to accusations that America is a neo-imperialist power that seeks to dominate other countries and impose its will on them. Additionally, America has a history of going to war and not knowing when to stop. They seem to always want to win more battles, take more territory, and ultimately achieve more victory. The answer is simple. Americans are some of the biggest consumers in the world, and they seem to always want more and more stuff. This has led to a number of environmental problems, as well as social issues such as obesity and a lack of focus on community. So yes, it does seem like Americans don't do anything in moderation. This can be seen in their foreign policy, their culture, and even the way that they wage war. However, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all, America is a very successful country by many measures. Their military is the most powerful in the world, and their economy is the largest. So perhaps there is something to be said for the American way of doing things. Ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide whether they agree or not. If Americans are to learn from the mistakes of the past, they must first understand them. Fortunately, many Americans don't know much about their country's history, and even those who do often have a selective memory. When it comes to America's role in various conflicts, this is why it is so important to tell the story of America's history of war and conflict. It's only by understanding our past that we can hope to create a better future. But unfortunately, many Americans don't know much about their country's history, and even those who do often have a selective memory. When it comes to America's role in various conflicts, some believe that America is on a path to becoming a true global empire. Others believe that its best days are behind it. Whatever the case may be, one thing is certain. The war in Afghanistan began in October 2001 following the 9/11 attacks. The U.S. went to war in Afghanistan in order to remove the Taliban from power. The Taliban is a radical Islamic group that had come to power in the late 1990s. They were known for their brutal treatment of women and their support for terrorist groups.
Wow.
The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan was swift and decisive. By the end of 2001, the Taliban had been ousted from power. However, the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan was much more difficult. The Americans were unable to prevent the resurgence of the Taliban, and in 2021, they withdrew from the country after a costly 20-year war. The war in Afghanistan is often seen as a failure of American foreign policy. It was one of the longest and most expensive wars in American history, and yet it ultimately resulted in nothing but humiliation for the U.S. America's history is deeply intertwined with war and conflict, often through covert means. This included supporting various anti-communist regimes. The Vietnam War was one of the most controversial conflicts in American history. It was a long and bloody struggle between the communist-led North Vietnamese and the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese. America's involvement in the war began in the 1950s, and it quickly escalated in the 1960s. By 1968, there were over 500,000 American troops fighting in Vietnam. Despite their large numbers, the Americans were unable to defeat the North Vietnamese. In 1973, the U.S. signed a peace agreement and withdrew its troops from the country. The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. The Vietnam War was a turning point in American history. It led to a general distrust of government and a feeling that America had lost its innocence. Many Americans came to believe that their country was no longer a force for good in the world. This feeling of disillusionment has had a lasting impact on American society. It's one of the reasons why so many Americans are opposed to war and interventionism today. Arming and training various militant groups and carrying out numerous coups America also fought in several major wars during this period, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Afghanistan War. These conflicts resulted in millions of deaths and left a lasting impact on American society. The Vietnam War in particular divided the country and led to a general distrust of government. For hundreds of years, they fought many wars against each other, first in England and then on the North American continent. These included the American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812 and both World Wars. In these conflicts, America established itself as a major world power. It also built up a massive military and developed a culture of war. The United States is a warrior nation, but it wasn't always like this. Originally, the land that would become the U.S. was inhabited by many different tribes and nations, with their own languages and cultures. In the late 20th century, it fought in the Gulf War, the Kosovo War, and the war in Afghanistan. Following the 9/11 attacks, America launched the global war on terror, which has seen it go to war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, among other countries. America's interventions have often been controversial. Many believe that they are motivated by a desire for oil and other resources rather than a genuine concern for human rights and democracy. Whatever the truth may be, America's interventions have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. But over time, through a combination of disease brought from Europe, war, and forced assimilation, most of these tribes were wiped out or absorbed into American society. Only a few remain today. In this episode of The World is One Big Family Show, as for the people who did conquer the land after World War II, America became the sole superpower on Earth. Despite this, America continued to intervene in conflicts around the world. Today, America is still a major player on the world stage. There's an old saying that goes, one example of this is the war in Vietnam. Another example is the war in Afghanistan. These are just two examples of America's history of war and conflict. There are many others. But why is this important? A lot of people argue that America doesn't do anything in moderation. This desire for more could also be seen in the American consumerist culture. And now for a message from our sponsor. Now back to the video. Now you're really awake. Can't go back to sleep now, can you? Inside, a young woman named Helen Viola stirs in her sleep. Helen lies down again, pulling the covers over her head, trying to banish the disturbing images from her mind. But sleep eludes her. And so it is that on this night of February 1861, Helen Viola becomes the first of many to hear the whispers of division. She is awakened by a nightmare, a vision of flames and smoke rising above the city. The brother fighting against brother, the families divided by loyalty and ideology. Their words carried on the wind like mournful spirits. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. They are members of the Sons of Temperance, a local group dedicated to the principles of personal responsibility and self-improvement through the practice of temperance. But tonight, their usual jovial camaraderie has been replaced by a sense of urgency and purpose. Her mind wondering why they have come to her. The leader of the group, whose name is Thomas, explains that they have come to enlist Helen's support in their efforts to aid the Union cause. They tell her that they plan to form a relief society to provide food, clothing, and medical supplies to the soldiers who will soon be marching off to war. As the smoke clears, the defenders of Fort Sumter slowly emerge, their faces grim, their uniforms torn and soiled. Together, they form a convoy of sorts. The women discuss the challenges that lie ahead and the sacrifices they will be asked to make. She realizes that they are all united by a common purpose, their differences put aside in the face of the nation's need. They talk of the shortage of supplies, the lack of trained medical personnel, and the overwhelming needs of the wounded soldiers. Each woman bringing her unique skills and resources to the effort. His voice is low, his words carefully measured. The scene that greets them is one of chaos and desperation. What would you like me to read? The soldier closes his eyes and whispers, "Anything, just read." And so Helen begins to read. She reads of heroic deeds in faraway lands, of love and loss and the beauty of nature. The city is overcrowded, the streets are dirty, and the hospitals are overwhelmed. The tension drains from his shoulders and a look of peace comes over his face. "I've seen so much suffering here that it is hard to believe," she writes. "Not only are they wounded physically, but emotionally as well. Through her words, we see the compassion, courage, and determination that it takes to serve as a battlefield nurse during the Civil War. She continues to visit the hospital each day, reading to the soldiers, tending to their wounds, and offering them whatever comfort she can. She becomes a familiar face to many of the soldiers, and they look forward to her visits. She is overcome with a sense of helplessness and despair, feeling as though she is making no difference in the lives of these wounded men. She learns the importance of self-care and the value of seeking help when she is struggling. The experience strengthens her resolve to help the wounded soldiers, but also reminds her of the importance of taking care of herself. She retreats to her room in the hospital, unable to cope with the horrors she has seen. Helen stands on the veranda of the hospital, a bittersweet smile on her lips. She, like everyone else, is filled with relief that the bloodshed and destruction are finally coming to an end. But she also knows that the true cost of war will be felt for generations to come. She wonders what her life will be like after the conflict ends, and how she will adjust to a world that has been so deeply affected by war. And the nation as a whole will struggle to heal the wounds that have been torn open by the conflict. She has witnessed firsthand the courage of the soldiers who have fought and suffered for the Union, and she remains committed to helping the wounded soldiers rebuild their lives. As the years go by, Helen Viola's story fades into the annals of history, becoming one of the many whispers of division that echo through America's past, as well as the compassion and dedication of the nurses and volunteers who have worked tirelessly to help them. The end of the Civil War is near. News of the surrender spreads quickly through Washington, D.C., and the people erupt in jubilation. Yet her story serves as a powerful reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of compassion and empathy in the face of suffering. She is awakened not only by the nightmare, but also by the call to action. For in her dreams, she has seen the flames of division engulfing the nation. And it is up to her and others like her to extinguish those flames and bring about a new era of peace and unity. Bonfires are lit, bells are rung, and parades are held to celebrate the Union's victory. Many of them have seen their friends and family die before their eyes. The constant exposure to death and suffering takes a heavy toll on her emotional well-being. She too is affected by the trauma she witnesses every day. They are haunted by the memories of those they have lost. Helen continues to read until it is time for her to leave. They know that she is not alone in her struggles and that they too have moments of weakness. Together, they help Helen recover and return to her duties. As she rises to go, the soldier opens his eyes and looks at her with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispers. "The hospital is crowded and the stench is terrible," she writes. "There are not enough beds, so many of the soldiers are lying on the floor. We do our best to keep them clean, but it is almost impossible. The nurses are overworked and exhausted, but no one complains. We are all doing our duty." "That was just what I needed," Helen asks softly, reaching out a hand to steady him. She writes to her mother about a young soldier who recovered from his injuries and returned home. "It was so wonderful to see him go," she writes. "He was full of thanks for the care he received here. It makes all the hard work worthwhile when you know that you have helped someone in their time of need." She knows that her small act of kindness has made a difference in this young man's life, and that knowledge gives her strength to continue her work. Sharing with them the stories she has heard and the experiences she has had. Through her words, we get a glimpse into the daily life of a battlefield nurse and the challenges she faces. The soldier hesitates for a moment before stepping into the room. "I wanted to ask you," he begins, his voice hoarse and weak, "if you could read to me." Helen's heart goes out to the young man. She understands that for him, a simple request can be a lifeline to sanity. Helen becomes increasingly aware of the toll that the war is taking on the soldiers and herself. She witnesses firsthand the horrors of combat, the physical and psychological wounds that can never be fully healed. Helen and the other women are immediately struck by the sheer scale of the suffering that surrounds them. She turns her head to see a young soldier standing in the doorway. His uniform is dirty and torn, his face pale and drawn. It is clear to Helen that he is suffering, not just from his physical wounds, but from the emotional scars of war as well. "What do you mean?" Visiting the various hospitals and clinics to offer their services. Helen, with her background in literature, is put to work in the patent office building, which has been converted into a hospital. Here, she attends to the wounded soldiers, reading to them and providing them with whatever comfort she can. Thomas takes a deep breath and meets Helen's eyes directly. She imagines the pain and suffering they have endured and resolves to do everything in her power to alleviate their suffering. We need you to go to Washington, D.C., and use your skills to help the wounded soldiers. Helen is stunned, where she will meet up with other volunteers who are also heading to Washington, D.C., to assist with the relief efforts. She never imagined that she would be called upon to do anything so daring or important. "There is something else we must tell you," he begins, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "We believe you have a special role to play in this effort." He raises his hand in greeting and calls out to her. "Good evening, Helen." With newfound determination, Helen prepares for her journey to Washington. D.C., she gathers supplies, including books on nursing and surgery, as well as bandages and other medical equipment. She also packs food and clothing for herself, knowing that she will need to be self-sufficient during her time in the capital. His voice is deep and resonant, carrying the weight of the task he and his companions have set before them. "We come to you with a message." They carry with them the somber message of Major Robert Anderson, casting long shadows across the land. Helen sits on the veranda of her home, lost in thought. The gentle breeze carries with it the sound of distant drums, faint but unmistakable beat that seems to echo the rhythm of the approaching war. Who informed his men that unless relief came soon, they would have to abandon the fort. The proud masts of the ships in the Patapsco River replaced by smoldering skeletons. She witnesses the spread of a great fire from one building to another. Each dispatch brings with it a fresh wave of anxiety and sorrow. Helen reads of the battles at Big Bethel, Manila, and Cartons Creek, where young American boys are falling victim to the bullets of their fellow countrymen. With each passing day, the dream of peace seems to fade further into the distance, replaced by the harsh reality of a divided nation. Each structure engulfed by leaping flames and collapsing in fiery ruin. Her dream is a premonition of the war that is about to engulf the nation, a conflict that will test the strength of the Union and leave scars that will not heal for generations. In her dream, she hears the crackle of burning timbers and the screams of frightened people. She sits up in bed, her heart pounding, and looks around the room as if expecting to see the flames from her dream reflected in the windows. So let me tell you a story, a whisper from our nation's past that has echoes in our present. It's a cold night in February 1861. The wind bites at exposed skin and rattles. Loose shutters against the window panes of a small house in Baltimore. Outside, the wind continues to moan and the trees sway as if in some spectral dance. She thinks of Fort Sumter, a lonely sentinel guarding the entrance to Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. She remembers the telegram sent from Washington, D.C., calling for supplies and reinforcements for the garrison there. But those pleas fell on deaf ears as the Confederate forces prepared to strike. At dawn on April 12, 1861, Confederate troops opened fire on the fort, sending a plume of smoke into the air. This is the first battle of the Civil War and the first bloodshed. In her dream, she sees the harbor choked with smoke and fire, like a ship without an anchor. Helen's thoughts drift to the troubled times ahead for the nation. Helen dreams of the toll this conflict will take on both sides. And as Helen drifts back to sleep, she hears the echo of the cannons and the voices of the soldiers as the days pass. Newspapers arrive in Baltimore carrying the latest news from the front. One evening, as the sun sets over the horizon, suddenly, a group of men appear on the road below, their faces grim, their steps purposeful. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a heavy beard, stops in front of Helen's house. Helen rises from her seat and greets them warmly. Helen is deeply moved by their words and pledges her full support. But as the men prepare to leave, Thomas turns back to address Helen once more. Helen's heart pounds in her chest as she asks, but as she looks into the earnest faces of the men before her, she knows that she cannot refuse their request. As she prepares, she thinks of the stories of wounded soldiers that she has heard from the newspapers. On the morning of April 1861, Helen bids farewell to her family and friends and sets out on her journey. She travels by train to Baltimore. Upon arrival in Baltimore, Helen is met by a group of women. Their faces a mixture of apprehension and determination. The journey to Washington, D.C. is a somber one. As the train rumbles along the tracks, despite the somber mood, Helen feels a sense of camaraderie with these women. When they finally arrive in Washington, D.C., undeterred, they set about their work. As the days turn into weeks, one evening, As Helen sits in the dimly lit room of the hospital, she hears the sound of footsteps approaching. "Can I help you?" She nods her head and settles into a chair beside his bed. "Of course," she says gently. As the soldier listens, his breathing becomes slower and more even. Helen smiles and offers him words of encouragement. Each night when she returns to her room in the hospital, Helen writes letters to her family and friends. In one letter to her friend Elisa, Helen describes the conditions in which she is working. In another letter to her sister, Helen talks about the toll the war is taking on the soldiers' mental health. Despite the challenges she faces, Helen finds moments of joy and hope in the midst of the darkness. Helen's letters are not just a record of her experiences, but also a testament to her strength and resilience. As the war drags on, Helen's resolve to help the wounded soldiers does not waver. But as the months pass, Helen begins to feel the effects of the war on herself. One day, while visiting a particularly gruesome scene, Helen suffers a mental breakdown. When Helen's fellow nurses discover her in this state, they rally around her, offering support and understanding. Through the support of her fellow nurses, Helen is able to continue her work at the hospital. As the war finally draws to a close, Helen's thoughts turn to the future. With the fall of Richmond and the surrender of General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, as the crowds cheer and dance in the streets, the wounded soldiers who have been under her care will bear the physical and emotional scars of their injuries for the rest of their lives. As the celebrations continue, Helen feels a sense of gratitude for the strength and resilience of the human spirit. The war may be over, but the healing process has just begun. Helen knows that her work is not yet done. Her contributions as a battlefield nurse during the Civil War are remembered only by those who knew her. And so it is that on this night in February 1861, as Helen lies in her bed, this is not a map of America. It's not even close. These are all the places where at least one person has died in the U.S. between 1607 and 2021. That's right. This includes every single death from the very first English colony at Jamestown through the present day. And it turns out that more Americans have died here than anywhere else. Can you name that place? During the war, thousands of soldiers and civilians died, not to mention all the indigenous people who were caught in the crossfire. But it didn't last long before the Americans took over. In 1776, the American Revolutionary War began. The British Army marched through the region, burning homes and businesses in an effort to put down the rebellion. But the following year, the Americans fought back in the Battle of Saratoga. In 1906, the United States experienced its first major urban sanitation crisis, when a contaminated water supply led to thousands of cases of typhoid fever in the city of Milwaukee. Public outcry forced federal intervention, leading to a report that outlined several major reforms needed to improve public health and safety. At the same time, Americans began to demand a greater say in international affairs, and military spending skyrocketed. But then came the Korean War. As American troops fought against the communist North Vietnamese, they suffered high casualties. Anti-war protests rocked the country, and eventually President Richard Nixon pulled the United States out of the conflict in 1973. Not to mention the over 7,000 American service members who lost their lives. Where have the most Americans died? Well, it's not this place or even this place. In fact, it's all of them. Even today, Americans continue to die every day, which means that this map will never be complete. Check out this video to find out more. The US may be the world's only superpower, but even superpowers aren't invincible. A conflict that was far more divisive than the Second World War. But in the meantime, the United States had entered the war on terror after the September attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan in October 2001, overthrowing the Taliban regime and killing Osama bin Laden in 2011. It's the one you never noticed, the one that's right under your feet. It's where you live. So they don't tell us where we've been, they tell us where we've died. Every point represents someone's final resting place, a reminder of the fragility of life and the passage of time. The war in Iraq began in March 2003 when the United States and its allies invaded the country, removing Saddam Hussein from power. President Harry S. Truman committed American troops to the defense of South Korea, but the North Koreans pushed them all the way back to the UN battle line. a decisive victory that convinced the French to join the war and fight against the British. But in 1918, another deadly disease swept through the country. Americans began fighting around the world in a global conflict. The war lasted 6 years and resulted in over 100,000 American deaths. And when it was over, the U.S. found itself in a strange position. The country was now a superpower and the winner of a global war. In Europe, American soldiers liberated concentration camps and stormed the beaches of Normandy. In the Pacific, they fought island-hopping campaigns against the Japanese, often in brutal conditions. The Spanish flu pandemic infected an estimated 20% of the U.S. population and killed 675,000 of them. Unlike the 1914 to 1918 World War, however, the impact of the pandemic was relatively even across the country. Pause the video here if you want to make a guess. Ending the war and recognizing the United States as a free and independent nation. Now, while the war was happening, most of the deaths occurred during battle. But thousands also perished due to disease, especially yellow fever, which swept through cities like Philadelphia, killing thousands. The United States spans over 9 million square kilometers. Both sides began seizing ships and detaining sailors from the other. The British impressed American sailors into the Royal Navy, claiming that they had deserted from the British and refusing to release them. After a series of provocations, the Americans declared war. But despite having the support of the Native Americans, the war went poorly for the Americans. An area larger than the entirety of Brazil or the combined territories of Canada and Mexico. In retaliation for the British invasion, but when troops returned to the capital, they found that the city had mostly rebuilt itself. And then came the Civil War, one of the deadliest conflicts in world history. From 1861 to 1865, brother fought against brother, and the death toll mounted. More than 620,000 soldiers died, most from disease, but many from battle. But given its size, only 5% of Americans actually live here. The Americans won easily, capturing cities like Havana and Santiago de Cuba. But they also acquired overseas territories, including Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Thousands of Filipino and Puerto Rican people died as a result of the war and its aftermath. But no territory was able to gain independence until World War II. This area contains just 33% of the country's total population. And some states like Wyoming, Vermont, and Alaska have vast empty spaces with fewer people living there than the entire city of Philadelphia. But throughout the country's history, more Americans have died in one place above all others. In fact, over 80,000 Americans have died here, which raises the question, how do you accidentally kill that many people? Disease and conflict with the Iroquois Confederacy continued to devastate the settlement until it was abandoned in 1664. Sieur de la Salle arrived in the territory and claimed it for the French king, naming it after the French province of New France. But the English weren't about to let the French claim their land without a fight. And in 1754, the French and Indian War broke out between the two European powers. The war saw many battles over the next 9 years, but things really kicked into gear in 1759, when the British captured Fort Albany and pushed the French further and further west. And although the English took over this area in 1664, the French also had their sights set on the region and began exploring the interior. Well, it started back in 1607, when the first English colony was established here at Jamestown. Settlers quickly found that the land was less welcoming than they'd hoped. Disease, starvation, conflict with the Native Americans, and swamp-based parasites killed them left and right. And by 1610, 2/3 of the original settlers were dead. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company founded a settlement nearby at Fort Orange, but it would later be captured by the English and renamed Fort Albany. In 1673, the French explorer Robert Cavelier. By 1763, the French had been defeated, and the Treaty of Paris ceded this entire region to the British. After 8 years of fighting, the British surrendered at Yorktown in 1781. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, and then came the War of 1812. As tensions grew between the U.S. and Britain, President James Madison ordered the burning of Washington, D.C. And finally, the Spanish-American War erupted in 1898 over the status of Cuba. That's because as the 20th century dawned, Americans began to feel the effects of industrialization, urbanization, and new technologies. As a result, many cities implemented major changes to their public services, which improved living conditions and increased life expectancy. And so we come to the deadliest period in the history of the United States, World War II. As the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, back home, women entered the workforce as factories geared up for war production, building tanks, ships, and munitions. It entered the Cold War with the Soviet Union and began occupying parts of Germany and Japan. For 3 years, the conflict remained deadlocked until an armistice was finally signed in 1953. The Vietnam War that followed was even more controversial. The war officially ended in 1975. Throughout the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, hundreds of thousands of civilians died. Today, the country is still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, which has killed over 1 million Americans. And so we come full circle to our original question. If you look closely enough, every single state on the map has seen at least one death. And that's the thing about maps. Even the newest state, Hawaii, admitted to the Union in 1959, has seen its share of tragedy. But it's not just about the past. So what's the answer? What's the place in the United States where the most Americans have died? Did you know that 15 U.S. states were originally owned by private individuals? What do you think about when you hear the name Aaron Burr? Is it the musical about his life? The fact that he shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel? Or maybe, if you're like me, the night he broke into James Madison's house and stole some top-secret documents. President James Madison is staying up late writing his annual address to Congress. This man was tall and thin with piercing blue eyes, dressed all in black. With nothing else to do, he prepared to leave the room and retire for the evening. He waited here for some time, pacing back and forth, until finally hearing the sound of approaching footsteps. He slipped out from his hiding place and stood over the fireplace mantel. He'd been dreaming of the strange man from earlier in the evening. He shook off the dream and got out of bed. He dressed quickly and ran to the fireplace. To his horror, the papers containing his speech were gone. They had actually vanished. Suddenly, he heard the sound of breaking glass. He rushed to the window and saw a man running away, holding his stolen papers in his hands. Wrote to his daughter that he believed his reputation had been ruined forever and that no one would ever think well of him again. His prediction was correct. Aaron Burr is still remembered today mostly for his duel with Alexander Hamilton and for shooting him. Madison shouted, "Stop, thief!" But the man kept on running. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a like and a comment. Also, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. Thanks again for listening, and good night. Madison grabbed his gun and fired, but he missed. The thief kept on running until he disappeared into the darkness. A man entered the room, not noticing the intruder. He was gone without a trace. Eventually, the people inside the house returned to their beds, still talking in hushed tones about the theft. Only the president and his wife Dolly stayed up the rest of the night, determined to come up with a plan to recover the speech. Finally, the sun began to rise, and so Dolly went to bed. James, however, stayed up for another hour, writing out a new speech to take the place of the stolen one. When he was done, he dressed and went to bed. The newcomer was tall, wearing a dark suit and carrying a lantern. It was not until later that he learned the identity of his nighttime visitor. Burr was wanted for treason by the U.S. government, so he was forced to stay hidden. Philip agreed to let him live on his property in a small cottage near Baltimore. There, Aaron lived in disguise, too afraid to even step foot in Maryland for fear of being arrested. But soon he became restless and tried to escape. Unfortunately, he was captured and thrown in jail. He was released 5 months later and went to Europe to live the rest of his life. You see, earlier that year, Aaron Burr had broken into James's office and stolen his papers. He had planned to publish them in order to discredit the president. When James discovered the theft, he had the papers burned. Now hoping to exact a little revenge, Aaron had broken into his house that night and stolen the draft of his upcoming address. He had intended to delay its delivery so that James would have to speak on a topic he hadn't prepared for. But it didn't quite work out that way. And now, Aaron was on the run, having set fire to most of the documents in his possession. He set his lantern down on the mantel and began to speak. The stranger listened intently, then said, "I want you to do something for me." The man in the room nodded and agreed. He would do whatever he could to help. The stranger told him that he needed a horse, a stout animal, and that he must have it immediately. The man in the room hesitated, but eventually agreed. He would get the horse ready and have it brought to the front of the house. The stranger thanked him and left the room. He turned off the candle he had been using and walked toward the door. As he passed by his desk, though, he noticed that something was missing. Several sheets of paper were gone. These papers contained the draft of his upcoming speech, which he had worked on for weeks. Now, they were vanished. Who could have taken them, he thought. Was someone spying on him? Had the British gotten inside the house? Or perhaps this was the work of one of the many deranged men who came to Washington seeking an audience with the president? Whatever the case, he had no way of knowing, and so he just shook his head and left the room. Most people who saw him would have put him in his late 30s or early 40s, but it was difficult to tell. His face was so gaunt and lined. The stranger left the house and disappeared into the darkness. The man returned to his post by the fireplace. Soon the sound of approaching hooves could be heard, and he stepped outside to greet the newcomer. He led the horse to the stable, then returned to wait by the fireplace once more. Soon, the stranger returned, mounted the horse, and rode away. The man walked past the front door of the house and went around back. He slipped in through an unlocked kitchen window and found himself inside the White House. What this man was doing, only he knew. But it soon became obvious that he was looking for something important. He opened drawers and cabinets, rifling through the contents, but couldn't find what he was looking for. He moved from room to room, desperate, until finally he came upon the war room. The window was open, and so he slipped through. In the war room, also known as the President's house, where these addresses were written, there were several windows which overlooked the rose garden. And through them, James could watch the beautiful flowers blooming below. One of these windows, however, was left open just a little bit. It wasn't a very warm night, and so James had left the window open to catch any scrap of fresh air he could. Little did he know that a midnight visitor would be taking advantage of the situation. So turn off your lights, get in bed, and settle down for a good night's sleep. Wait, what's that? No time to explain. Hit that subscribe button before you go, and I will begin. You were first introduced to him in an old-school cartoon where he was voiced by the great Mel Blanc. Today, we're going to take a look at one of the lesser-known stories about Aaron Burr. The year is 1812. America has been at war with Great Britain for 2 years now. Earlier that evening, a man had been seen skulking around the White House. James Madison had finished his address and set it down on his desk. Outside, the intruder made his way to the East Room, where he hid behind a curtain. The man looked after him, unsure of what to make of the mysterious visitor. Back in the war room, James Madison awoke suddenly. Madison called for help, and soon the entire White House was out searching for the thief. But it was no use. The next day, he got up and went to work drafting a new speech. Aaron slipped across the border into British-controlled Maryland, where he met up with an old friend, Philip Freneau. In 1836, we reached the end of our story. Thank you for listening. Have you ever been outside when your hair stands on end and a cold wind seems to blow across your skin, even on a summer night? It's a feeling that makes you shiver and at the same time gives you goosebumps. And that night, he would be forever changed by what he saw in the darkness. Are you ready? Well, then let's begin. Maybe there's a monster nearby, or a ghost, or something just beyond our understanding. Lee had surrendered after his troops suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of the Wilderness. But just 1 month later, he was back on the offensive. See, even though morale was low and supplies were running out, if he could find something to tell his colonel, he might become famous and perhaps even get promoted. So he rode faster, and as he passed over a small rise in the road, he saw a large group of Union soldiers gathered together around a fire. As he walked over to the tree where the Union soldiers had hung their captives, he saw that there was another noose there. And when they learned that McCloskey had been killed, they started to cry out in anguish. But Mosby held up his hand and silenced them. You see, during the Civil War, it wasn't uncommon for soldiers to fight against each other while also being friends. In fact, many of them had been friends long before the war began. And although politics had driven them apart, they still had a strong bond. The truth is that it was also about something else entirely, states' rights. See, in the North, most people believed that the federal government should have more power than the state governments. At the same time, Southerners felt the exact opposite. To them, it was the states that had more power than the federal government. And this was especially true when it came to slavery. You see, in the South, most families had one or two slaves that helped them work their fields and take care of their houses. Maybe McCloskey and Mosby are still friends today. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and subscribe to our channel for more historical tales. Who knows? Maybe they're watching over us right now, waiting for the day when they can finally reunite. And they argued that the federal government couldn't tell them what to do with their property, so they felt that the states' rights were being violated. To understand what I mean, let's imagine that you're part of a big family with 4 kids. Eventually, the southern states left the Union and formed their own country, called the Confederate States of America. Lincoln felt that he had the authority to end slavery, even if it meant going to war with the southern states. On the other hand, Jefferson Davis and his Confederate Army were willing to fight to the death to protect states' rights. That's exactly what they did for 4 long years. He even elected a president, Jefferson Davis, who argued that it was his job to protect states' rights no matter what. Because of this, John McCloskey ended up dead, and Colonel John Mosby decided to follow him. But like most stories, there's a lesson to be learned here. No matter what side of the Civil War you were on, these men were brothers who had once been close friends. And even though they were fighting on opposite sides, they still respected each other. After all, they had been friends before. Politics drove them apart. However, President Abraham Lincoln of the United States disagreed. He believed that slavery was wrong, and that the federal government had a duty to abolish it. So as soon as he took office, he sent out troops to force the southern states to come back to the Union. Each kid has their own room, but they all share a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. Now, what happens if one of the kids says that they don't want to follow the rules anymore? What if they decide that they don't want to clean their room or do their homework? Instead, they want to stay up late playing video games and eating candy every night. Well, the answer is obvious. The parents would get upset and punish them until they agreed to stop. That's why when McCloskey told Mosby about the hanging, he was deeply affected. Not only had the Union soldiers murdered one of his best friends, but they had done so without giving him a proper burial. So by hanging himself, Mosby was showing McCloskey the ultimate honor. Instead, he bent down and picked up the rope. After all, we can't help but wonder, was this really just a tragic accident, or was there something more sinister going on here? Well, to answer this question, let's take a closer look at what was happening in America at the time. After tying one end to the tree, he climbed up and put the other end around his own neck. And when his men asked him what he was doing, he simply replied, "I must go to see my friend McCloskey." And underneath it, lying on the ground, was a rope. Now, this was odd because not only did McCloskey not have a noose around his neck, but he hadn't even been shot. So why did the Union soldiers bother to hang him if they knew he was already dead? Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. There in the middle of the campfire was a man hanging from a tree, his clothes torn and his face contorted in a silent scream. Lee's army was still made up of fierce fighters who refused to give up. In fact, he didn't need to be a military genius to realize that this was probably a trap. You see, this sort of thing had happened before. Oftentimes during the Civil War, commanders would send out spies to gather information about their enemy, only to have them captured and executed in front of the other soldiers. This was supposed to discourage anyone else from trying to sneak around. So after seeing this grisly spectacle, McCloskey turned his horse around and rode as fast as he could toward his colonel. So when they heard that Union General George Meade's forces were spread thin, they seized their opportunity to attack. He stroked his long white beard and tapped his cane against the ground as if deep in thought. But everyone knew what he was thinking. If what McCloskey said was true, then they were walking right into an ambush. And sure enough, when the sun came up the next morning, they found themselves under fire from 3 sides. Even though the Confederates fought bravely, they lost 27 men, including McCloskey, who died trying to help a wounded comrade. Well, in 1864, a man named John Mosby was walking near his farm in Virginia when he experienced this very sensation. It was May 1864, and the American Civil War had been raging for 3 years. By now, people were weary of the fighting and the endless stream of dead bodies. They also knew that President Lincoln wanted to abolish slavery once and for all. Meanwhile, Confederate President Jefferson Davis wanted to keep it around, which meant that the war wasn't going to end anytime soon. And with so many men already gone, both sides were getting desperate. In fact, In April of that year, Confederate General Robert E. And that is why John McCloskey was in such a hurry that evening in May, you see. McCloskey was a member of the Confederate Army's 43rd Battalion under Colonel John Mosby, hence the reason they share the same last name. And earlier that day, Mosby had received orders to take 200 men and scout the area around Spotsylvania Courthouse, Virginia, where the Union troops were camped out. Mission was simple. Gather intelligence so that Lee could plan his next move. But there was a twist. If they found anything interesting, they were supposed to report it directly to him. And since Mosby was several miles away, McCloskey volunteered to ride out ahead of the others and deliver the news personally. So as he rode his horse through the dark, he thought about how important his mission was. McCloskey didn't need to be a military genius to know that this was a bad omen. As he told his tale, Mosby listened intently. After the battle, when Colonel Mosby approached the spot where McCloskey had fallen, he noticed something strange. Well, Mosby didn't have time to ponder this question because his men were quickly gathering around him. Now, some people might say that this was the craziest thing Mosby could have done, but the truth is that he was acting out of respect. But this story doesn't end here, because there's more to it than meets the eye. You see, even though we tend to think of the Civil War as being about slavery, well, this is exactly what was happening between the northern and southern states. And as time went on, things got worse and worse. This led to the outbreak of the deadliest war in American history, the Civil War. And when it came to states' rights, but even though the war was over by 1865, the fighting didn't stop. And who knows? Thank you for watching. Once upon a time in the land of America, there were two groups of people who were very different from each other. One group was made up of people who had come from Europe many years ago, and they had built their lives in America. There was a powerful and greedy king who wanted more money and more land. The king just laughed at him and said that he could do whatever he wanted because he was the king. But they knew that if they left, the king would take all of their stuff, and then he would have even more money and power. Then they put some clothes on it and made it look like a real person. He sent his guards to stop the people and take away their leader, but the people wouldn't let the guards take their leader away. They fought back, and the guards couldn't win against them. In the end, the king had to watch as the people paraded through the streets with the wooden man, and he knew that he had lost. The people were very happy that they had won against the king, and they could finally live in peace. They had shown that they were going to let anyone treat them badly, and they would fight for their rights. The king was also happy that he could finally live in peace. He had been fighting with the people for so long, and he was tired of it. He knew that he had made a mistake by trying to take away their rights, and he was glad that he could give them back. The people had shown him that they were unafraid of him anymore, and that they would fight back if he tried to hurt them again. The king just laughed at him and said that he could do whatever he wanted because he was the king. But they knew that if they left, the king would take all of their stuff, and then he would have even more money and power. Then they put some clothes on it and made it look like a real person. Finally, they put a hat on its head and made a sign that said, "Give me liberty or give me death." He had been used to everyone being afraid of him and doing what he wanted them to do. They showed him that they weren't going to let him treat them badly, and they would fight for their rights. The king was very frustrated that he couldn't control the people anymore, but he knew that he had to listen to them. He had never had to listen to anyone before, but he knew that if he didn't listen to the people, they would keep fighting against him, and he would keep losing. But now he saw that the people were stronger than he was, and he didn't have the power over them that he thought he did. He felt like he had lost everything, and he didn't know what to do next. They respected each other and worked together to make their land a better place for everyone. The king learned that it was ungood to try and take away people's rights, and that it was better to listen to them and work together. The people learned that it was important to keep fighting for their rights and not to give up even when things were tough. Together, they built a strong and happy community that lasted for many years. Then they carried this big wooden thing through the streets of the city, yelling, "Remember, the king is coming," where everyone was equal and no one had to be afraid of the government taking away their rights. It was a story that people from all over the world could look up to and be inspired by. Everyone in the city saw the wooden man and the sign, and they knew what it meant. The people were very happy that they had won against the king, and they could finally live in peace. They had shown that they were into going to let anyone treat them badly, and they would fight for their rights. The king was also happy that he could finally live in peace. He had been fighting with the people for so long, and he was tired of it. He knew that he had made a mistake by trying to take away their rights, and that it was better to listen to them and work together. They had all been treated badly by the king, and they were all tired of being afraid of him. So they joined the group carrying the wooden man, and they also yelled, "Remember, the king is coming." Other people wanted to fight the king, but they knew that they weren't strong enough to beat him in a fight. Just when they were about to lose hope, one of the people had an idea. He told everyone to go home and get all the tools they could find, like hammers, nails, and saws. Then they all met back at the town square and made a plan. This made the people who had come from Europe a long time ago very angry. They had never been treated like this before, and they could unbelieve that the king would be so mean to his own people. He sent his guards to stop the people and take away their leader, but the people wouldn't let the guards take their leader away. They fought back, and the guards couldn't win against them. In the end, the king had to watch as the people paraded through the streets with the wooden man, and he knew that he had lost. The people had shown him that they were unafraid of him anymore, and that they would fight back if he tried to hurt them again. They decided that they needed to do something to stop the king and protect their rights. They respected each other and worked together to make their land a better place for everyone, where everyone was equal and no one had to be afraid of the government taking away their rights. It was a story that people from all over the world could look up to and be inspired by. The king learned that it was ungood to try and take away people's rights, and that it was better to listen to them and work together. The people learned that it was important to keep fighting for their rights and not to give up even when things were tough. Together, they built a strong and happy community that lasted for many years. Finally, they put a hat on its head and made a sign that said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Then they carried this big wooden thing through the streets of the city, yelling, "Remember, the king is coming." Everyone in the city saw the wooden man and the sign, and they knew what it meant. One group was made up of people who had come from Europe many years ago, and they had built their lives in America. He was a powerful and greedy king who wanted more money and more land. He looked at the people who had built their lives in America, and he thought they were perfect for him to make money off of. So he started making laws that took away their rights and made them work hard for very little pay. The people who had come from Europe a long time ago were sad because they had lost their rights and their way of life. But the people who had just arrived from Europe weren't happy either. Even though they had dreamed big dreams, they didn't want to live under such a cruel king. They loved America, and they wanted to keep it the way it was. The other group was made up of people who had just arrived from Europe, and they had big dreams for themselves and for America. These two groups didn't always agree on things, but they lived together peacefully, and they all loved America. They had all been treated badly by the king, and they were all tired of being afraid of him. So they joined the group carrying the wooden man, and they also yelled, "Remember, the king is coming." Other people wanted to fight the king, but they knew that they weren't strong enough to beat him in a fight. Just when they were about to lose hope, one of the people had an idea. He had been used to everyone being afraid of him and doing what he wanted them to do. But now he saw that the people were stronger than he was, and he didn't have the power over them that he thought he did. He felt like he had lost everything, and he didn't know what to do next. He told everyone to go home and get all the tools they could find, like hammers, nails, and saws. They showed him that they weren't going to let him treat them badly anymore, and they wanted to be free to make their own decisions. The king was very frustrated that he couldn't control the people anymore, but he knew that he had to listen to them. He had never had to listen to anyone before, but he knew that if he didn't listen to the people, they would keep fighting against him, and he would keep losing. Then they all met back at the town square and made a plan. This made the people who had come from Europe a long time ago very angry. They had never been treated like this before, and they could unbelieve that the king would be so mean to his own people. They decided that they needed to do something to stop the king and protect their rights. He looked at the people who had built their lives in America, and he thought they were perfect for him to make money off of. So he started making laws that took away their rights and made them work hard for very little pay. The people who had come from Europe a long time ago were sad because they had lost their rights and their way of life. But the people who had just arrived from Europe weren't happy either. Even though they had dreamed big dreams, they didn't want to live under such a cruel king, loved America, and they wanted to keep it the way it was. The other group was made up of people who had just arrived from Europe, and they had big dreams for themselves and for America. These two groups didn't always agree on things, but they lived together peacefully, and they all loved America. For many years, everything was fine until one day when a new king came to power. One day, one of the people who had come from Europe a long time ago went to the king and asked him why he was treating them so badly. So they met together and talked about what they could do. Some wanted to run away from the king's land. They worked all day and night, and by the next morning they had made a big wooden thing that looked like a man. When the king heard what was happening, he was very angry. The king was very sad that he had lost his power over the people. As the years went by, the people continued to fight for their rights, and they won many battles against the king. Finally, the king agreed to let the people have their freedom, and he gave them all the rights they had lost. From that day on, the king and the people lived together in peace and harmony. And so the story of America became a story of freedom and democracy, and that is the end of the story. The end. Once upon a time in the land of America, there were two groups of people who were very different from each other. For many years, everything was fine until one day when a new king came to power. One day, one of the people who had come from Europe a long time ago went to the king and asked him why he was treating them so badly. So they met together and talked about what they could do. Some wanted to run away from the king's land. They worked all day and night, and by the next morning, they had made a big wooden thing that looked like a man. When the king heard what was happening, he was very angry. The king was very sad that he had lost his power over the people. As the years went by, the people continued to fight for their rights, and they won many battles against the king. Finally, the king agreed to let the people have their freedom, and he gave them all the rights they had lost. From that day on, the king and the people lived together in peace and harmony. And so the story of America became a story of freedom and democracy. And so the story of America ended with the people winning against the king and creating a land of freedom and democracy for everyone. Thank you for joining this gentle journey through America's quiet history. If this story helped you relax or drift off to sleep, please consider subscribing for more peaceful tales like this one. New stories are on the way. Until then, sleep well. Good night.
Please subscribe my channel.